Okay, Edwina, thank you very much for your introduction, and Joy, thank you very much for asking me to speak this afternoon. The topic that I've been given is to talk about challenges, and I think you wouldn't have a program about some sort of education initiative or development unless you added something about the challenges. And certainly over the course of today, as I've been listening, a number of the challenges have been the sorts of things that have been simmering and coming up that people wanted to give voice to. And I did think that I could probably stand here and not say very much and just open the floor, and we might have a bit of a discussion about what those challenges are, particularly at 4 p.m. in the afternoon when the day is getting long. So I've decided not to do that. I guess why I've been asked to speak is to offer some of my thoughts around some of the challenges. I'm not proposing to come up with the solutions in the next little time that I have. We have a panel discussion after this where we might start to think about what some of those solutions are. But by talking about the challenges and thinking about how we might consider challenges, that would logically lead us to think about what some of those solutions might be. So what I'm going to talk about is to really break down this topic. In particular, I've been asked to talk about the challenges that students and teachers face. And when you look at the level of teachers and students, then you're dealing with things that are actually at a practical level, you know, the practical concerns. A lot of the discussion so far has been really theoretical, and we can position, and that's really important that we position our discussion within a very theoretical base. But when you talk about teachers and students, it's about practice. And perhaps what gives me some credibility to talk about this topic is that where I have come from is about that actual ground level, dealing with the practical issues on a daily basis. And my role as sub-dean is about seeing those practical issues from a faculty-wide level. So hopefully I've got something to say. Even though we've been talking about practice-based education all day, I'm not sure we've actually talked a lot about what is practice-based education, other than more broadly. And these were just some of my thoughts around it to really pull that together this afternoon. And that is that it's education preparing graduates for practice, and we tend to link that to professional practice. It's education based on and in practice, that it focuses on the capabilities that our students require for practice. It involves teachers understanding and representing practice, that we have to have some sense of what practice is. It involves students doing practice. And I think probably most interestingly for me, it's about some sort of prediction about what future practice might be. One of the things that I'll run through a little bit this afternoon is that we tend to think historically, when we teach, we look at our historical notions of practice, where we've come and what we've learned, but we're teaching a group of students who will be the future practitioners. And it's interesting to think about how we change that historical view to a future view for them. And that's a challenge in itself. When we think practice-based education, one of the difficulties I had pulling this talk together, and it wasn't actually that easy to encapsulate all the challenges into 20 minutes, was that we do need to think about what PBE encompasses. And today we've already had that discussion about what's will, we've talked about workplaces, we've talked about being in universities. And so to position where I see PBE, I'm going to talk about PBE being both what happens in our universities in regard to practice, and also what happens in workplaces when students go out to experience practice. So in the university, learning and teaching is about practice, but actually it's removed from the practice. We take it out of that practice setting and we situate it in classrooms. If we think about workplaces, we are actually talking about our students going out from our universities into those workplaces themselves. And so when thinking about challenges, I'm thinking about that we can talk about them in any one of those spaces. When you think about drilling down for PBE for teachers and students then, for teachers the question is, how do I develop and deliver teaching activities that fit within a framework that is PBE? What is it that I actually have to do? And when we think teachers, I want us to put forward that we think about ourselves as academics, but we also think about the workplace educators who are teachers of our students as well. That we need to have a broad view of who is teaching, because we can tend to become very, I guess, self-centred or looking at ourselves within universities without thinking about who those teachers might be. And for students, there are learners of practice. They're experiencing PB as a means to a future in work. And they may think more broadly, and certainly Carol Joy, about service and what they might be to our community. But for a lot of their time, they're thinking about a future in work. There are some generic challenges in PBE, and why I say there's some generic challenges, because when you start to think about what might be the challenges in education and what might be the challenges in agriculture and what might be the challenges in a health discipline, you actually start to think about what PBE looks like in each of those, and often it can actually be quite different, and so different challenges get thrown up depending on what your discipline or your profession actually is. So by thinking generic, you think, well, okay, what are the common things to some of those? And one of the common things is that there's difference, perhaps, between the two. And it's not easy to reduce it to a single list of challenges to address. And the types of challenges we can think about can vary from questions of pedagogy, they can questions of curricula and design, but they can also drill right down to that fundamental question of, have I got enough placements for the number of students I've got? And as I said, for teachers and students, it's often the practical concerns that are the challenges we face on a daily basis. So how am I thinking that we can spend the rest of the time now thinking about challenges? And I've thought that rather than offering solutions, as I said, that we might look about those challenges and try and identify them. You know, give ourselves a framework by which we might be able to think about challenges, so that when putting together these experiences and dealing with the concerns, we can check, you know, what are they and where might they be. I'm going to talk about them from the point of view of what is PBE and what it requires to do PBE. I'm going to, because I thought I had to have some sort of alliteration to sound sort of academic, that I might have something starting with the 3 Fs. And so I've put together frames of reference, fidelity and funding as 3 areas of challenge. And so I'll talk about those. And then I'm going to finish with a little bit of theoretical information about talking about learning systems and some of the work from Wenger, which will not be new to many of you. I'm sure many of you will go, oh yes, we've heard this before. But I'm going to pull out of his work some of the things that I think are useful to think about challenges for, and how we might start to think about addressing challenges. So what are the elements of doing PBE? As I said, when it comes down to it, we deal with these practical concerns. Okay? These are a couple of my students who look far more engaged in having their photo taken than they ever did in class, I think. But what are the elements of doing? And as I flick them up, what you can start to say is, yes, I do have to think about that. And then you can tie fairly quickly a challenge to that, you know, about what might be a challenge associated with it. So when we start to think about including practice-based education in our courses, well, we start to ask questions about why. And what are our goals, our motivations and our outcomes that are associated with that. So our first challenge is actually being able to articulate why we want to do this. And that it's not just a good idea, but there might be some reason or purpose to it. We are driven, and we've heard this a couple of times today, that we are often driven to include PBE through accreditation and discipline practices. Sometimes the decision is not ours to include, and it's an external force that's doing that. So that poses a challenge. And importantly, what it poses on us is the type of PBE that we might do and what might be considered acceptable PBE, what types of experiences our students need to check off that they've done. When we think about the pedagogy curricula, how we're actually going to do it, there's challenges that arise in because we have choices about how we do things. There are then starting to get into, once you've made all of those educational type decisions, you then start to get into some issues, and this is where we start to push into the workplace as being students going into practice, that challenges come around how the processes we use, regulations and policies start to impose themselves on you. And anyone who's working and has worked in work integrated learning or placements will tell you that a lot of time can get bogged down in processes, whether students have their immunisations done. Anne-Marie will go, yes, check. In health, that becomes an incredibly time-consuming issue for people to deal with. There are issues of risk management, and risk management, when you look at PBE, there are risks. There are risks when you send your students out into another industry. There are risks to your organisation, there are financial challenges associated, there are risks to the students personally around that, and we need to think about those things. There are industry relationships which are just a whole challenge in themselves. Jan's given us this morning some ideas about how we might do that, but that's not to say that they're not challenging to do. Having staff who have the capabilities, the skills that are required, and having staff themselves, and research, I just lost which one came up next. Research and scholarship, because what we want to do is have that underpinned by some scholarship about why we're doing the things we do. Having adequate resourcing for all of this. And finally, are we actually doing it well at all once we put all of that in place to actually establish a program? So it's not surprising that people who are trying to run these programs or teachers doing PBE can get very bogged down in all of this range of activities that pose challenges for them. Okay. I said the next thing that I was going to, next way of looking at challenges might be not to break it down in the sorts of things you have to do, but to consider these things which I've labelled frames of reference, fidelity and funding. Now, if I begin with frames of reference, where I'm going with this is to think about remember this is the challenges for teachers and students, and I'm particularly going to talk here not so much about the practical issues around have I got enough placements for my students, but rather how teachers decide what to teach and how to teach it, and how students actually learn from those things that we give them. So this is kind of focusing on that aspect of challenge. So a frame of reference is the context or viewpoint or set of presuppositions or criteria with which a person's thinking seems to occur. It constrains selectively the course and the outcome of those activities. It's the way we view the world. And what it says is the way we view the world shapes how we act in that world. Now, when you think about practice and you think about teaching, our frames of reference for those from our experience and the way that we've formed them can be quite different things. And if we just look at the photos here, I haven't got a pointy thing on this one, a university tends to be our frame of reference, if we just look at it physically, is about books and tables, and this is the library at the Learning Commons on the Albury campus of Sturt University. When we think about practice, and I've tended to pick health pictures here, mostly because that's what I had accessible to me and I spend a lot of time doing. But it's a good image in terms of a nursing ward to say that practice can look very different. So people who work in practice and students who go into practice see a very different thing than what they view when they're on a university campus. And as teachers, what we're trying to say is that we're trying to live in this world and teach you about this one, or we're trying to take you from this world and shift you into this one, and you're supposed to cope with it. You know, and that's what we do repeatedly, and that itself throws up challenges. If I unpack that a little bit more about what are the different things about those environments we try and negotiate, is that universities tend to be about, if we think about classrooms and we think about having a whole class of students, and that might be any number of them in our courses, we tend to have activities that are formal. We tend to be a bit more theoretical, that's the aspect that we're offering. We tend to offer generalisations about how you might do something. So even if we offer case study up to our students, we still talk about the general rather than the individual. We tend to make ideas explicit, and the things that happen are explicit activities. They're all quite conscious, and students' learning experiences are quite episodic. They come to a class, my class is scheduled on a Monday, the lecture goes from 9 to 11, that's their experience of learning my material. If we place them into a practice setting, those environments tend to be more informal, they're definitely practical, they're all about doing, they're about particular instances and experiences. Things that happen are often implicit and tacit within the experience and not so overt to students, and the type of learning they gain in those environments is a cumulative one. And so they're very different frames of reference that we offer if we think about practice and we think about teaching. So some of the teachers' challenges, and I've broke the teachers down into our on-campus teachers and then also our off-campus teachers, and thinking about what might be some of the challenges. One of the interesting ones, and these are just my selection out of frames of reference, but one of them is whose practice is an interesting challenge for a teacher, particularly if you've come early, you've come from practice and you've come to teach. One of the thoughts that you have early on is, oh my goodness, all these students are going to do what I teach them. They're going to become, little models of me that are running around in the way that I practice. And that's not an unusual thought from a beginning academic to think about whose practice and what it is that they convey to students. And that means that also in questions of what they teach and what they assess is also about what is valued by that person and their frame of reference. So there's some real questions and challenges about what I choose to teach. I think another interesting group of teachers that we need to think about in practice-based education are what we could label the service teachers. And that's not a great term to use, but if we think about some of our professional disciplines, we will have practitioners who are from that discipline. Yet we will have people who provide service teaching. And Dan, I think you gave this example of you're seeing yourself as perhaps being one of those service teachers to nursing who came from a psychology background and taught into that group. They can be the science teachers, the person who teaches anatomy to the students. They can be the sociologist who teaches to our students. What they don't possess in common with the discipline person is they don't have the same practice. And yet we expect them to provide our students with a foundation that is intended for practice. You know, and Jan dealt with that by going out to see what practice looked like. But it's interesting to think about that group and how disenfranchised they might feel and how many more challenges they might feel. We have a lecturer who's quite keen that physiotherapy students should be able to use a pipette. And we would argue that perhaps as a physio student you don't really need to be able to learn to use a pipette. But his argument, well, one of the ways to think about him is that that's his practice. And if he's going to teach you to be a scientist in his practice, then that would involve learning to use a pipette. So I'm throwing that in as something to think about. Teachers are challenged by knowing and understanding practice to teach it, and that means the obvious elements but also the tacit and embodied evidence. They are trying to teach in a context that is removed from practice, and they have, as I said, a historical view of practice, preparing students for an unknown practice. All of those are very interesting things to think about what you decide to teach. For off-campus students, those people who are teaching in work, again this question of whose practice. Again, they have to be able to unpack their practice to teach it to somebody else, and they have to have ways of doing that. For this group, they often have competing demands to be the practitioner that they are and also being a teacher, and those things don't necessarily sit well together. They can be very competing for people. They often have lack of formal preparation as teachers, so they don't have a pedagogy to do it, they just are practitioners. And when it comes to assessment, they sometimes view themselves as gatekeepers to the profession. And that's how they view it. Okay. Now for our students, some of the discussions I've had over the last couple of weeks have been about students' preparedness to go on placement and into outside in a work environment, and the preparedness to be practitioners. And I found this photograph at the top on our Student Services website, which clearly looks like students having fun at university in some type of social activity. And it made me realise, and then I had my picture of the library, and I realised that students' frames of reference when they stand in the university and they do the things that they do as a student, that frame of reference can be very different to the frame of reference a week later we throw them into when we put them in an ambulance and send them out on a placement. And most students adapt to that okay, but some of them don't. And that's the challenge, is how we help our students to realise they're about to go and see the world in a very different way from the way they saw it last week. For me, putting those photos together made me think about how, when we're trying to address that challenge, how might we think about that? Students' challenges on campus. When we place them on campus and we try and teach them about PBE, we underestimate how much they have to imagine the practice world to be. Students have to have fantastic imaginations, because we know what practice looks like, but they're just trusting, and we're trying to represent it in some ways, but they have a fantastic imagination. And I've never really thought what that might look like inside their heads. But I now think, from students who probably don't get it right, that they're imagining something totally different to what I'm imagining. So I think imagination's a really useful thing to think about when you think about challenges. They have an incomplete understanding of practice as a whole. We know what the whole big picture looks like. They don't. They've just got bits of it. In workplace learning, the challenges are they've got the capability, they need to have the capability to learn from work, and they actually need to learn assessment practices which are very different from the practices that they're used to. Okay. Now, if I go on to my next F, which was fidelity, I've chosen fidelity because it started with F. Probably a better word would have been authenticity, but that didn't start with F. So I would have lost my theme. But fidelity kind of works, because most people who talk about simulation as being a representation of practice like to use the word fidelity. And what fidelity means is being faithful or loyal. And what we're being faithful or loyal to when we do practice-based education is we're loyal to our practice and what that might be. It is about being authentic and real, and that means the context, the emotions and the processes associated with actual practice. As teachers, that's what we're trying to capture for our students when we try and teach it to them. And you can see that there's various teaching opportunities that we try and bring into our classrooms to actually try and represent that practice to students. Simulation is one, Second Life is another one. We get models in, we use actors, we use role plays, and as teachers in an on-campus setting, we do an awful lot of work to try and show them what practice might look like, because we want to create that feeling of authenticity and reality about what they might reasonably expect. It's reproducing and approximating the practice world. We need to understand and explain practice to them, and we need to structure learning activities that develop that practice. So we really have to know what practice is. And as I said, the biggest thing for students, they have to imagine it a lot of the time. For fidelity in work-based learning, it's high fidelity by nature. But that means that when students are immersed in it, it can be complex, it can be difficult, and it can be overwhelming, because all of it comes to you at once. And it requires an understanding of how learning might occur in that environment. Okay. And then with assessment, the university-based assessment, we try from our assessments of students when we assess practice subjects or practice activities to predict how that person might perform in the future. And that's really quite challenging, because I don't know that we always do have assessment tasks that allow us to really understand how students might perform. And work-based assessment, there's some real questions about responsibility, consistency and validity, and how assessing students in work might actually impact on their learning. Now, I wanted to talk about funding for a little bit, to not be political or contentious, and not to be critical perhaps of how universities, but to raise the issue that when you get into a discussion with most people about the challenges in practice-based education, it invariably comes down to money. You know, and the funding available, and people's feelings that they have lots of things that they would like to do and like to be able to do, Second Life, simulation, but what stops them, and the biggest challenge they find, is finding somebody who will direct funding towards that. And so I think if we're going to attack the challenges of PEB, we have to have strategies that deal with how we get the dollars to do it. So, interestingly, what the lack of funding, or a lack of a clear funding stream for work-based learning or professional-based education, is that people can feel marginalised and undervalued in their institutions. And there's been certainly work done that suggests that that's in fact how people feel. What it costs to do PBE, we know what it costs. It costs those high fidelity resources, in fact, cost dollars. The more we try and represent practice, the more it costs. It takes staff to do it. In terms of work-based learning, in physiotherapy a number of years ago, a question was asked of all of the heads of physiotherapy programs what clinical placements or workplace learning cost. This was in response to the government wanting to give them money to do it. Do you know what they said? It doesn't cost anything. Now, why would you say that? And the reason they said it at the time was because the sites, all of the placement sites, all of the hospitals were taking students on goodwill, they were providing the placements, there was no cost. Big mistake. Because, you know, now obviously we know what it costs, and work-based learning is not, and it should not be and is not, an unfundable activity. It costs our teachers, it costs our students, it costs the sites that take our students. And that's a big issue. There is substantial goodwill. There are substantial things, and the questions about service learning, partnerships are all about some of the issues, but we need to consider that it does indeed cost. Now, one of the funding challenges, partly we need to know the costs and we need to know the value of what we're doing, because we can't have conversations about adequate funding unless we value it. If we say things like, oh, it'd be a good idea if the students went out and got some practice experience, well, not many people are going to fund a good idea. You know, unless there's some reason why it's a better idea than all the other ideas that are looking for funding. And so we need to know the value of it. We need to understand who pays, and we need to understand how the costs might be integrated to how universities distribute funding and the existing funding models. We need to get savvy about those things. And we need to be able to argue successfully for the resources for PBE. You know, we have definitely seen a change in universities about valuing PBE, and there is funding flowing towards it. But at the end of the day, if it's going to be a new science lab versus practice-based education, then we need to be able to argue the relative merits of those two things to our students. Okay, so if I just finish up, just my last ones, Francis. I said I was going to talk briefly about Wenger. Many of you will be familiar with the work of Etienne Wenger from his work on communities of practice. Well trotted, I won't say well trotted out, but lots of people have talked about communities of practice. It's a very common theory that's applied to how people learn, and particularly in practice, how communities form where people share learning. And he describes them as social learning systems, and that people belong to them. Now, an example would be that, you know, within a practice or a discipline, or members of a profession might be a community of practice because they hold within them certain knowledge and languages and ways of speaking. We might think about the industry with which we are trying to engage as being a community of practice, and we might think about ourselves in the university as a community of practice. We might think about our students learning to be in a profession as a community of practice in their own right. Now, I don't want to go too much more into Wenger than that, other than to say that one of the things that I think he offers, which is interesting, is to think about the notion of boundaries between those practices, and that someone trying to get into a particular practice or a community needs to cross that boundary. So our students learning to join our disciplines need to cross the boundary of that community in order to become part of that. And what he says is, as I said, those learning to practice need to negotiate the boundaries. Those teaching may have connections to the community but may not belong to it, and that we see these boundary objects and interactions. And what Wenger offers that's quite interesting, I'll do his quote first, that boundaries can create divisions and a source of separation, fragmentation, disconnection and misunderstanding. And when we think about a lot of the challenges that face us trying to get students into placements, it's often, if we think about it, some of those boundaries where we might actually look. Yet they can also be places of unusual learning, places where perspectives meet and new possibilities arise. And what Wenger suggests is what we should actually do is to work at the boundaries. And we should actually think about who are the brokers who go from one community to the other community, and think about how they do the things that they do in order to bridge those communities. So for our students go from the university of our community and they go into the community that's work. They are our brokers. And what we might do is think about how we help our students to move from one community to another, and that might be one of the ways we think about the challenges. If we think about our teachers trying to broker placements, again, let's think about the differences between us and the points at which we differ, and that's the way we have our discussions about things. And that might be a useful way to think about it. Interestingly, I think when you look at who some of the brokers for placements are, often that responsibility falls to administrative assistants who are ringing up and asking for the placement. A lot of the work and the engagement actually falls to that person who's trying to broker across that community. And so some of the challenges might be helping that person better do that thing. And then our workplace teachers as brokers, they're trying to see what it's like in the academic world. They don't necessarily have the language and the skills to do that, but they are trying to broker with us as well. So it's perhaps a useful, I'm not really offering this useful thing to perhaps add to think about it. And some of the things we have, artefacts, common language and shared processes are some of the things we might think about using to broker. So in conclusion, look, this is really what it's like running PBE. The challenge is to get from over here to over there without getting lost and ending up going the wrong way, and as we'd all know, probably we wouldn't be able to do that with some sort of map. There probably isn't a map, and so we'll all just drive around and round and round and eventually work out where we should be. And on that note, I'll thank you.